There is a song by the wonderful singer and songwriter Mary Chapin Carpenter that has been following me around this fall. It's called "The Calling," and the words remind me of the calling of the young Samuel, sleeping in the darkness, wondering what in the world or who in the world has happened to him. The song goes like this: deep in your blood, or a voice in your head, on a dark, lonesome highway it finds you instead, so certain it knows you, you can't turn away. Something or someone has found you today. Genius or Jesus, maybe he's seen us, but who would believe us? I can't really say. Whatever the calling, the stumbling or falling, you follow, knowing there's no other way. Thank goodness in our story this morning for old Eli, who probably had been following a voice inside of his head for a lifetime, or the young Samuel might have missed a prophetic calling for justice and love and a lifetime of ministry on behalf of his people. Have you ever heard a voice, the voice of God calling you? The story of Samuel suggests that the Lord's word was rare at that time and visions were infrequent. In our time, we fear mistaking the divine voice for just another human sound. There are so many voices in our world competing for our attention. We tend not to trust the cacophony of noise around us, but it is also difficult for us, I think, in this time to be still and to know that God may be speaking our name. We might laugh, especially this morning, at the sureness of Tim Tebow's prayers before, during, and after football games, but we also may feel just a tad bit jealous of Tim's cocky sureness that God has a personal plan for him and the Denver Broncos. And if you watched the game yesterday, maybe that plan will come to fullness next year. We take a big risk when we dare to believe that God is calling our name, trying to get our attention. The scriptures are filled with folks who heard God calling their names. Remember Sarah and her husband Abraham, Isaac, Joseph, Esther, and all those Hebrew prophets scattered throughout the Hebrew Testaments. Samuel was called into a lifetime of service and obedience on behalf of his people. And Jesus was one who called a motley group of folks into itinerant service by calling their names along the shores of Galilee. I wonder, when I think of them, how many of them would say that it was an easy choice to make, yes, but that they were called into their dream job, somebody's calling us now, and an easy life. Looking at the call of Jesus, I wonder if he knew the depth of God's plan for his life and for his ministry. And I wonder if Jesus knew that the road he stumbled upon would lead to an early death on a cross. It's been an extraordinary fall here for me at FCCB. Andrew is not in his chair right now. He's out working with the young people. But it has been an extraordinary time. We have these remarkable and amazing young people with us, Andrew and Meredith, Sam, who has returned home to Seattle, and Tinley. When I think of them, I think of me a long time ago. This past Friday came and went very quietly for me. I worked on this sermon and reflected on the day. It was the anniversary of my ordination to Christian ministry, which took place 32 years ago, right out there in the Hall of Entrance. Some of you who are worshiping here this morning were present on that Sunday afternoon to bless and ordain me, and I am eternally grateful. It was for me a Samuel moment. I had been following a call, stumbling and falling for a long, long time. Ordination to Christian ministry was an affirmation of that call and a moment when the Elis gathered around to empower a young ordinand to move forward in faith and trust. Every person needs the aid of others in order to discover their calling. So how can we know? How can we trust the voice of God calling us? How else except to do as the characters of today's story, to listen, to trust, and to take a risk, venturing forward into the unknown by faith. Perhaps there is even a more primitive moment in that process. It is the moment that the psalmist identifies for us this morning. You knit me in my mother's womb. You are before and behind me. Your knowledge of me is wonderful, and it is complete. Perhaps our deepest and truest calling is buried somewhere in our innate natures as reflections and refractions of the light of the divine presence which lives and guides each one of us. Now, there is a less theological way of saying this. If the word calling sounds a bit bewildering to you this morning, at the still center of our very being, there is a promise, a potential that shapes and guides us and gives us sound shape and form for our future. Something is calling me, the voice of the future. It is not my destiny or fate, but it is the world into which I am walking. When modern psychology talks about the search for meaning and purpose, it is one way of getting at the question of the intention or purpose of an individual life, our calling. As followers of the Spirit on a Spirit-filled path, we can say it another way. We are called by God into the future through this deep voice resonating within each one of us. Now, on this morning, we celebrate, we remember, and we give thanks for the life of Martin Luther King Jr. He heard a voice in his life that called him to free a nation of racism, prejudice, and institutionalized segregation. God gave to him the gift of a prophetic voice and a strong vision that allowed him to minister to the conscience of our country and demand a wake-up call for millions. He pursued his calling with relentless compassion, vigor, and faith in nonviolence. Along the way, he had to ignore the calls to violence that occasionally came from within his own ranks. He had to stand up to the violence of a Bull Connor and an angry South unwilling to change. And he had to rise above the demands of a dominant culture, which often condemned his dreams and smeared his integrity. He even found himself suspending the cries of his own children and his own family in order to hear the voice of God calling him forward into life. In his sermon, Our God is Able, King tells the story of a conversation that he had with God in which he hears an inner voice calling him into being. He says in that sermon that it had been a particularly strenuous day and that he had settled into bed at a late hour. The phone rang, and he picked it up, and an angry voice on the line said, "Listen, nigger, we've taken all we want from you. Before next week, you'll be sorry you ever came to Montgomery." King hung up but he could not go back to sleep. He began to walk the floor. He went into the kitchen and he heated a pot of coffee and he sat down at the table and he writes these words, "In a state of exhaustion, with my courage almost gone, I determined to take the problem to God. My head in my hands, I bowed over the kitchen table and I prayed aloud. The words I spoke to God that night are still vivid in my memory. I am here, taking a stand for what I believe is right, but now I am afraid. The people are looking to me for leadership, and if I stand before them without strength or courage, they too will falter. I am at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I've come to a point where I can't face them alone." At that moment, at that very moment, King says that he experienced the presence of the divine. An inner voice came forth out of him with these words, "Martin, stand up for righteousness, stand up for truth. I will be at your side forever." Dr. King says that at this very moment, his fears began to pass and his uncertainty evaporated. He writes that God gave him the inner calm to go forward. 3 nights later, their home was bombed, but King stayed calm. His experience of God's voice in the inner reaches of his being gave him new strength and new trust. Martin Luther King Jr. trusted in God's call in the innermost regions of his being. In the ancient words, we hear King's response, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." How can we listen for God in the midst of the noise and the distractions of our lives? What might we hear if we listen deeply? Is there a word under the words for this congregation as we face a new and different future in this 12th year of the 21st century? Where are we being called? How will we go forward? The calling that each of us has arises out of the very core of our being, and the imprint already on our spirits. You are my beloved. In you I am well pleased. The word comes as our call to do the work of truth, righteousness, and justice in God's world. And God knows there is more than enough justice work to go around. Global and neighborhood poverty, human trafficking, the power of racism and xenophobia in our own community, in the community of the world, inequities and opportunity, the 99 and the 1%. All our cries and our world cries for justice, and each is calling our name. The word that comes out of 1,000 dark nights and speaks our name is the word that calls us into the future, but also into our essence, into our essential calling as Christians. Samuel, Samuel, Samuel. Martin, Martin, Martin. And you can add your own name right here. In all this, we know that God's love for us is persistent. It was persistent for Samuel. It was persistent for Martin. Even if we are hard of hearing or fail to listen, God is guiding us forward even now. Our deepest vocation as Christians arises out of the psalmist's words, "You have searched me, O God, and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. Even before a word is on my tongue, you know me completely." Vocation, the calling, is that voice calling to us in the depth and the regions of our being, to be, to do, to become what we were created to be, to fulfill the promise and the potential that is the divine spark, the eminent Spirit of God living within each one of us. Stop, look, trust, listen. Our ears will tingle. Amen.